Assalamualaikum et bonjour. Today we are going to continue learning the passé composé. We have seen in the first part of passé composé, introduction of passé composé. We have looked at the definition of passé composé and also at how we are going to use it in a sentence. In part 1 of passé composé, we have seen at how passé composé is made of. What are the components needed to form a passé composé? The most important part in part 1 of passé composé is to explain for you to understand when do we use passé composé auxiliary avoir and when do we use passé composé auxiliary être. Okay, and also what are the two exceptions for verb using auxiliary être? Well, in part 2 of passé composé here, we are going to continue from where we have stopped. Okay, so now let's get started. Before we look at the verb auxiliary avoir and être and also participe passé, let's look at this chart. Okay, so these are the components of passé composé. We have the first one, auxiliary avoir or auxiliary être. So this will be your first component. Next, we have the second component, which is participe passé. So these two are needed to form passé composé. Alright? I have explained in detail which verbs are using auxiliary avoir and which are using auxiliary être. So now, let's look at the verb avoir and être, which will be used as auxiliary to the passé composé. You have your avoir, j'ai, tu as, il, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles ont. You have être, je suis, tu es, il, elle est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils, elles sont. Right? Now, let's look at how the main verbs of passé composé are transformed or changed to the participe passé or what we call past participle. By now, you should be able to tell how many groups of French verbs that we have. You should know how to differentiate which verb belongs to which group. If this is not within your knowledge, please refer to my clip entitled French Verbs. Okay, so there are of course 3 groups of French verbs. You have regular verbs, which is the first and second group of French verb. The first group is it ends with ER, the second group ends with IR, and the third group are irregular verbs. Okay, so we'll look at the first and second group. Alright, now let's look at this first. Let's look at these groups and let's learn how these verbs are changed to past participle. For the past participle, for the first group ends with ER. Okay, just for ER. Okay, now for the past participle, normally it will change to ending accent aigu like this. So you have acheter becomes acheter, parler becomes parler, aller becomes aller. Please notice the verbs are spelled differently, but the pronunciation stays the same. Okay, acheter, acheter, parler, parler, aller, aller. Acheter means to buy, parler to speak, aller to go. Okay, now let's look at the second group of French verbs ends with ER. IR, sorry, no. The second group French verbs end with IR. Now, for the past participle, normally it will change to ending in I. Here we have finir, fini, choisir, choisi. Okay? Right? That will be for the first group and second group. This is only for the past participle, okay? The second component. Now, let's look at the third group, okay, which are consisted of normally irregular verbs. Okay, right. For this group, the third group, which is consisted of irregular verbs, you have few variations of past participle that you need to know. Some of the verbs will transform just like you see here in this chart. Okay. Nevertheless, no worries. The focus of our assessment will only be on those verbs which you have seen in our textbook. Okay. So you have few variations here. Boire, bu, lire, lu. Partir, parti. Suivre, suivi. Dire, dit. Écrire, écrit. Prendre, pris, and mettre, mis. Okay, this will be the second component, which is the past participle. Right? Now, okay, let's look at the group 1 and 2. Okay, so this is the past participle. Okay, all right. Okay, so we have seen the first part and the second part. The first component and the second component. Right. Now let's take a look at how these verbs are conjugated to the rules which you have seen in this clip. Okay, remember we have passé composé with auxiliary avoir. Okay, right. One of the example is the verb jouer here. Second, passé composé with auxiliary être, which we're gonna see later. And under this passé composé, we have two. The first one, all the verbs which we listed earlier. The 14 verbs. 14, yeah? One of the example is the verb aller, to go. And also all the verbs which are under category of verb pronominal, which we have seen in chapter 3, okay? Alright, we're going to look at those later. So we're going to see the first example here with auxiliary avoir. So you have here the verb jouer, which is formed with auxiliary avoir. So this is auxiliary. This is the first part, first component. And this is the past participle, the second component. Okay, so you have the first component with the auxiliary avoir. The second component, which is the verb jouer, it becomes past participle jouer. Okay, right? Okay, we read this all together. J'ai joué, tu as joué, il, elle a joué, nous avons joué, il, elle a joué, nous avons joué, vous avez joué, ils, elles ont joué. Well, you can make a link here when you can. Nous a, vous a, ils, elles ont, elle a. Okay, so you can make a liaison here, a link. Okay, when you read. But that's not the focus of this clip. Okay, the focus is passé composé. So you have two examples of sentences using the verb jouer in passé composé. You have le week-end dernier, Amina a joué au foot avec son frère Michael. It means last weekend, Amina played football with her brother Michael. Okay, a joué is played in passé composé. The second one, la semaine dernière, Aris a joué au cerf-volant. Last week, Aris played kites. Okay, so this is the example of verbs using auxiliary avoir. Now, let's look at passé composé with auxiliaire être, right? This is être, not avoir, okay? So here we have passé composé from the 14 verbs, which is using auxiliary être, and we choose the verb aller here to show you how it is conjugated. Now, the only difference with just now, that you have just now, this passé composé, you need to add endings to it. Endings, and also es. Can you see that? You add ending to the verb aller. Okay? Now I'm gonna explain this later. Alright. Okay? But with auxiliary avoir, you don't need to add ending. It's just a normal past participle. Okay? Alright? So that will be the only difference. The only difference that you have between passé composé auxiliary avoir and être is that the verb jouer, you do not add any endings, like or even add es to the past participle jouer. But here, you need to add endings. Okay? The endings of the past participle of passé composé auxiliary être, again I repeat here, only auxiliary être depend entirely on two things. So you have here, the first one is gender of the subject, whether it's masculine or feminine. The second one is quantity or number, whether it is singular or plural, whether it's one person or even more than one person. Let's look at what do I mean by gender. The first point is gender. Now, here you have two people. Okay, you have Tom and Lola. Tom said, "Je suis allé." When he speaks, he says, "I went." So there is no ending added to the past participle. Okay, allé. Alright. But when Lola said, "Je suis allé," okay, so she says, "I went." The ending "a" is added because she is a girl. Okay, can you see that? For male, no need, but for female, you add "a." Okay, now my second point is, it depends on the quantity or number. Okay, let's look at this. Okay, let's look at this first. You have here two pairs. The first pair is Tom and Lola. The second pair that we have here is Lola and Lina. So now, when Tom and Lola said, "We went," nous sommes allés. Okay, nous sommes allés. See that? We add the ending "s" to the past participle to show there are more than one person, and it is obviously in plural form. You add "s" for Tom and Lola. But when the second pair, which is Lola and Lina, say "we went," we add the ending "es." Because why "es"? Because Lola and Lina are ladies, two girls. So when we have a subject in plural form and all ladies, we apply the ending "e" for all ladies, all feminine, and "s" to show plurality or more than one person. So we add "e" because Lola and Lina, girls, and "s" because plural. But here Tom is a guy and Lola is a girl. So you add "s" only. Now let's recap this. Okay. Now, for one person which is feminine, we add the ending "e" to the past participle auxiliary être. For two person and more, we add ending "s" to the past participle auxiliary être. And when two person and more than two, and all ladies, like just now Lola and Lina, we add the ending "e" and "s" to the past participle auxiliary être. Okay? Alright? Okay? So now, let's read the verb aller just now. Okay, so here you have. Okay, that's why here you have two choices. You have either aller like this or aller like this. Same pronunciation but different spelling. Well, the first aller here is for male when I is a boy, and for the second aller is when I is a girl, female. Okay. So, I'm going to read this. Je suis allé, again, link here. Tu es allé. Il est allé. Allé, the T. Elle est allée. Okay, if you can see here clearly, this is clearer, okay? So, here, il, he kan? He. So, you add E, normal E. You don't add anything actually. But L, because she, you add accent aigu. Il est allé, elle est allée, because he and she. Okay? Now, I repeat all over again. Je suis allé, tu es allé, il est allé, elle est allée, nous sommes allés, vous êtes allés, ils sont allés, elles sont allées. Okay, right? Okay. Now we have the examples for the verb using aller. Okay, we have la semaine dernière, Vincent est allé à la plage avec son ami Patrick. Last weekend, Vincent went to the beach avec his friend Patrick. Okay, the second example, Hani est allée en France avec son cousin Asfar. Hani went to France with her cousin Asfar. Okay, so you have the first example of the verb using auxiliary at, which is ali. Okay, so here you have passé composé avec auxiliary at as well, but it is unique because it is for the verb pronomino. Verb pronomino is what? When you have verb constructed with se. Se promener means to go for a walk. Okay, so the last verb that is shown here is the verb pronomino, which is also using auxiliary at with the endings that we have just seen earlier for both genders and quantity: masculin, féminin, singulier, pluriel, male, female, singular, plural. So here we have the verb pronomino. Okay, se promener, je me suis promené, tu t'es promené, il s'est promené, elle s'est promenée, nous nous sommes promenés, vous vous êtes promenés, ils se sont promenés, elles se sont promenées. Wow. Okay, please be careful with the endings that we're supposed to add when there are differences in genders and numbers. Only for the verb passé composé using auxiliary être, not avoir, okay? Only être. Now we have here the examples. Hier soir, Aïda s'est promenée au jardin avec son chien. Last evening, Aïda went for a walk in the garden with her dog. Second one, Julien s'est levé à 6 heures du matin. Julien woke up at 6 in the morning. Okay? Right. Now, to sum up, the verb in passé composé, two components are needed to form the French passé composé. Okay, look at this. The first component is auxiliaire, avoir or être. You have to choose either avoir or être. The second one is past participle. Okay, so I hope you are able to get the main idea of part 2 passé composé. Few points that need to be taken care of. One is, what are the passé composé verbs which are formed with auxiliary avoir? Second, what are the passé composé verbs which are constructed with auxiliary être? And most importantly, when it is using auxiliary être, how passé composé with auxiliary être is formed when there are different genders and numbers. You have to add the endings, either or es. Okay, right? Such as genders and numbers, such as masculine, feminine, singular, and plural. Well, that is the part 2 of passé composé. Do ask questions when you feel the need to do so. I am wishing all of you bon courage, bonne continuation et merci beaucoup.